Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we're going to discuss the latest peace negotiations to secure an end to the war in Ukraine. We're also going to talk about ongoing talks that relate to the implementation of the U.S.-EU trade deal, as U.S. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick and USTR Jamieson Greer met with their EU counterparts last week. That was right before Thanksgiving here in the U.S. And then we'll turn to our conversation with Cecilia Malmström, the former EU Commissioner for Trade and Home Affairs, to discuss the EU's trade agenda. We hope you enjoy the show, and we hope you had a great Thanksgiving as well. Max, let's start with Ukraine. You and Michael Kimmage had a great episode on the 28-point plan that came out of the US or Russia, or we're not quite sure. The episode was released on December 1st, but the plan was released the week before Thanksgiving, and it launched a barrage of commentary and pushback and all kinds of feelings from every side. So we're not going to recap the plan in too much detail, also because since then there's been a lot of talks everywhere. In Europe, in Florida apparently, today in Moscow. So let's talk about where we stand with those peace negotiations. What's your view of what's going on?
Well, I encourage people to listen to the previous episode. I think this is largely a merry-go-round where we're going to spin around in circles and end up in the same place. The basic gist here is that the Ukrainians know that the Russians aren't actually serious about peace talks because the Russians think that they're winning the war, and the Russians know that the Ukrainians know that they're not serious about peace talks. So this is, I think, in some ways, a theatrical performance for Washington. So where we are now is that they've had over the Thanksgiving weekend, there were talks with Witkoff and Kushner and the Ukrainians where they can try to get to an acceptable place, I guess, to then go to Russia, where Witkoff and Kushner are going to go to talk to the Russians. The basic problem here is that Witkoff and Kushner are operating as if this is a real estate deal and all that Moscow cares about is some economic incentives. Meanwhile, what Russia actually cares about is Ukraine. This is about geopolitics, it's about culture, it's about nationalism, it's about all those things. The economics part doesn't really play much of a role, but they're just operating in very different places. And you can see this when Witkoff's call with an advisor to Putin was leaked by Bloomberg, and you could read the transcript. So I think maybe to shift gears, though, how is Europe approaching this? And I think it's described as Europe is operating track changes diplomacy. They can't just make edits. They have to put on track changes to make sure. And I think this reflects a broader problem with European foreign policy, that there's sort of this illusion, I think, that European countries have, that they're sovereign when it comes to foreign policy and defense. And that just really hasn't been the case since 1945. America has led on shaping and managing European defense, and that by extension means European foreign policy.
But when you say that, just to clarify, are you saying the illusion is that they think they're sovereign, but actually more decisions are being made in Brussels these days? Or they think they're sovereign, but no one in Europe actually has sovereignty, and the U.S. is the one that has all the influence?
I think both.
Okay.
Right. And I think one of the biggest reforms that the European Union could make is to go to qualitative majority voting for foreign policy. Because one of the problems is this age-old Kissinger question of who do you call when you want to call Europe? And it extends to this. Who is engaging Russia on behalf of the Europeans? Now, the Eastern Europeans aren't really in position to because of their animosity towards Russia. So Kaja Kallas in some ways is not an appropriate interlocutor, or has sort of positioned herself not to be an appropriate interlocutor because of all the things that she said about Russia, most of which I agree, but some of which are just not diplomatic. And that is both her charm, but also if you are the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy, it creates a bit of a problem. And I don't think she wants to be the major interlocutor talking to the Russians. So who is that person? And right now what you have is a bunch of European leaders that sort of get together. So we have the E3, Starmer, Macron, and Merz getting together to be how do we sort of run interference on this 28-point plan? But where's the red phone that we have here in Washington to the Kremlin to say, hey, what the hell are you guys doing? This represents a massive escalation. And I think it's important that Europe try to figure out who that is. Maybe it's a special envoy. Maybe it's someone like Mario Draghi. Alexander Gabuyev wrote this in the Financial Times. He used to be at Carnegie Moscow, now in Carnegie Center in Berlin that focuses on Russia. Europe needs to have someone that is engaging with the Russians, because what we're about to have is the US, I think, is really pulling itself back from these talks. Our aid to Ukraine is diminishing, something we've talked about. So at some point, probably next year, we're going to not be a factor. So how does Europe engage Russia? I think is a question that needs to be asked. And that extends itself to these talks, because if Europe has no channel to Russia, well, then it's just sort of on the sidelines, hearing from the Ukrainians and then hearing from the Americans about what Witkoff and Kushner are planning with Moscow. None of this, I think, puts Europe in a good position. And so thinking about how Europe integrates on foreign policy, or at least specifically on this issue, I think is important. And right now, Europe is very much sidelined.
Well, it's also difficult because there are some leaders who are talking to the Kremlin, like Viktor Orban, but not the one we want, or the one that is likely to bring to Moscow with him the kind of position that is consensus among European leaders. But then I think back to a few years ago where Macron was trying to engage with Putin. Everyone was like, oh my God, I can't believe he's doing this. And now it feels like maybe this would be a time to do this and try to not re-engage for the sake of re-engaging. Like the Germans have tried that before. It clearly didn't work. But I agree with you. There's a lack here. And because of that lack of direct engagement, Europeans get run around, and the US Russia direct communication is what's taking over everything. So in the meantime, Brussels is just looking left, looking right, trying to wonder, well, we have ideas. Do you want them? And nobody's taking them.
Well, one of the problems with having the E3 is, well, what is the Baltic states' input there? What is
Yeah.
Denmark's
Yeah,
influence?
it's a lot of overlapping like Venn diagram circles, especially on the institutional perspective.
Yeah.
Like the UK is not in the EU, so they're not part of some of the discussions that are happening right now in Brussels. Also related to the reparation loan, which we
But
can
there's
talk about.
but there's no input from smaller states about what they're thinking, and it's sort of essentially two broke countries and one country that has a real economic
Yeah,
problem.
and you could argue that also they didn't come to the table with their own plan. The reason there's so much fretting about this 28-point plan that came up a couple weeks ago is that they have a lot of ideas to respond to it, or like points of it that they don't agree with. But what was their plan anyway?
Yeah, I think part of that to defend Europe is that because Russia has no interest in peace talks. So it's a little bit hard to sort of say, well, what is your peace plan when you just know that the other side doesn't want to talk? And so you don't want to sort of negotiate with yourself about getting into a reasonable place when it comes to talks when Moscow has not shifted from its unreasonable place. But I do think that this just hits on a broader issue when it comes to European foreign policy. And maybe just by extension, all this focus on the coalition of the willing just makes my eyes roll. And this is a French UK initiative, basically very early on in the Trump administration, because Trump is going to negotiate peace. And ergo, we Europeans need to show that we back President Trump, and we are going to be ready to put in this reassurance force, this multinational reassurance force that Russia has to agree to. And then, oh, by the way, the Americans have to have a quote unquote backstop, which means if the Russians ever shoot at us, then America goes to war with Russia, which literally the thing that the United States foreign policy is very united on is we don't want to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. Biden administration, Trump administration both agree. And so Europe is spending all this time focused on that. From a military planning perspective, I think it's actually quite useful to think about how this would work, but it's not connected to the political reality of how this would actually happen. Meanwhile, this 28-point plan is getting in the way of the reparations loan because the Belgians now are saying, well, if you're going to have to unfreeze the Russian frozen assets for this peace plan, how are we going to do this loan that's then attached to them? Which is a reasonable point. And no one in Europe wants to be like, because this is never going to happen. And I think that this is where Europe just needs to get a little bit more serious about how it sees this war continuing, how it sees this war going, what it sees its role, what it thinks that the US role is going to be realistically in 2026 and 2027, and start operating that way. And what we see with Europe is just constant reacting with no clear, this is what we have to do to take charge of this situation. Because frankly, what the Trump administration is signaling very clearly is they don't care. They want to wash their hands. Good luck to you all, as Trump tweeted. And that, I think, is where this is ultimately headed.
Yeah, and I think the point about the long-term vision is a really good one, and also transpires even in the conversations around the frozen assets. Belgium has a list, and I say this being one, and it's really painful. It has a list of reasons why it thinks it's a bad idea or it's concerned. Honestly, half of those reasons I don't really agree with, and they have been disputed with, I think, very good arguments. And there are backstop options that could happen. There's also some really worrying, not rumors, but just dynamics going on around the Belgian budget and how much tax money goes to the Belgian national budget from those assets that are being held. And you see this and you're like, okay, well, maybe we could show a little less self-interest and like think bigger and longer term. But as you've mentioned before, one way to get around all of these concerns longer term is to invest together and have more of that backstop. And we just can't get there. It's a huge impediment to moving forward without always having to like nitpick, well, how about this? And now the European Central Bank has also said, well, we're not backstopping this loan. So
Right. I do think that some of the Belgian complaints like have some legitimacy where it's like if we release 140 billion and suddenly we get sued and we lose in court in 10 years, and then that 140
well,
billion
also
is a
because
hell of a lot of money to Belgium.
at the national level, also just for context, there's a lot of very complicated and very difficult decisions being made right now about the budget because we're close to excessive deficit procedure and the government just announced changes in taxation and spending. So they have to deal with all this already. So facing down something like this is a mountain.
Well, right. Where I sort of stand on this is the EU is going to figure this out, that this is going to happen. But the 20-point plan has sort of gotten in the way. It'd probably be easier just to do Euro bonds. I think ECB should sort of get its head out of the sand and sort of recognize that this is sort of wartime Europe as well. And everyone needs to think a bit more creatively. I think there's been a long problem that European foreign policy is basically run by finance ministers that are kind of oblivious to the foreign and defense policy ramifications. So you have great talk from defense ministers at NATO ministerials, and then the finance ministers who aren't there are like, well, that's never going to happen. So I think there needs to be a bit more coordination and integration of the financial and foreign policy sides, because really Europe's role here is to be the financial backstop for Ukraine. And that, I think, takes us to the last thing we want to talk about briefly, is that there was also a visit right before Thanksgiving where Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, and Jameson Greer, the U.S. Trade Envoy, were in Brussels for a meeting with all the European trade ministers. And behind closed doors, I think the meeting seemed to, I guess, go okay. But both Lutnick and Greer then went on Fox News and had some really sort of strong words. Do you want to?
Where all diplomacy goes to die.
Yeah, Fox News ain't great for transatlantic diplomacy, perhaps.
So basically, Lutnick and Greer were going there, try to move forward the trade negotiations that we've been in the middle of since the summer, when there was this framework agreement that was more framework than agreement and had some provisions that were quite vague, including things like looking at regulation, especially in the digital world, but also European investments in the US, etc. So this is just an effort to keep moving that ball forward because both sides would like to keep unlocking some elements of this, lowering tariffs, etc. But what became clear very quickly is that after those closed door meetings, Lutnick decided to go all out on the digital regulation rulebook in the EU. That's mostly the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. We've talked about those before, so I won't go into detail. But they've clearly decided this is in the sights. And they want Brussels to start either really paring down the regulation or, in his word, I guess, quote unquote, taking it off, which, I don't know how you do that. When it's a law that has passed, we should remind everybody that this is on the books. It is being implemented in the EU. So,
well, it's sort of being implemented. But to take a law off the books requires passing a law,
correct.
Which is like, not the easiest thing to do.
Some fines are starting to get levied against some companies, I should say many of which are American, but, the biggest tech companies. So he's trying to say, well, Europe should just get rid of this. And if they do that, American companies will invest tens, hundreds of millions of dollars in Europe in all kinds of things, including data centers, which is a little bit confusing because I don't think those are US government decisions necessarily. Those companies make those decisions. And aside from that, those companies also make a lot of money. I know they get a lot of fines in Europe, but they also make a lot of money in Europe. Just as an example, in 2024, Alphabet's revenue from the EMEA zone, so Europe, Middle East, Africa, but mostly Europe, was $100 billion, which is a third of their global turnover. So it's a fairly lucrative market. So the idea that if the rules stay in place, those tech companies are just going to leave and not invest in Europe at all, I don't understand how that works.
Yeah, it's not like they're not making money in Europe.
Because there is this closeness with the tech industry and this current administration, you could say maybe some tech companies could be incentivized to try to put pressure on Europe. But it sounds to me like it's probably the other way around. Some of the companies trying to pressure the US government to put pressure on Europe. But that doesn't mean it's going to lead to them just leaving Europe entirely.
Yeah, well, they can't leave Europe entirely, and if Europe took action to sort of decouple from American and Chinese tech, I think you would have US tech companies quickly changing their tune. So if we see things like the State Department putting in place sanctions against European officials for implementing the Digital Services Act, then that would, I think have a transformative effect on European adoption or continued adoption or continued embrace of US tech. That would be terrible for US companies in the long run. But maybe just a few other quick thoughts. I think one, it's sort of a sign that no deal is ever really done with the Trump administration. The trade deal was struck, but now there's lots more haggling taking place over the digital regulations. And Teresa Ribera, the executive vice president of the European Union, so number two, that oversees the tech portfolio, after they left town, said, no way we're going to dismantle the DSA and DMA. The second thought is that EU regulations are not perfect. We should not pretend that they are. They do have some problems. There is this whole omnibus effort to kind of go back and look at the regulations, and there's big questions, and this is where it's very difficult. Okay, how much of this is just like sorting things out a bit, streamlining, that was a little too onerous, we're going to make this a bit more effective, where you're actually improving the law, or how much of this is actually just sort of caving to US pressure? And I think the problem that the EU has is it's sort of signaling both. It's sort of saying, we're not caving, but then it's kind of telling the Americans, oh, we're doing this omnibus that is going to make things better and do a lot of the deregulation that you want.
And notoriously, what the US side loves to hear is some technical explanation of EU rules and
Yeah,
processes, like
but
omnibus.
they're saying, sort of deregulation. So in some ways, you could say this is a little bit of a détente where the EU maybe does a little bit of deregulating, but not fully, and the US accepts that. I guess the question is that where this is going to end up? And maybe the third thought is I'm sort of surprised that we're now in December and this hasn't destroyed the transatlantic relationship yet, frankly, because just given when you looked at the inauguration and you looked at all the tech CEOs, and Mark Andreessen and others basically doing interviews with Ross Douthat and saying that the EU tech regulation is, totally terrible, and basically being out to destroy EU tech regulation because they see this as the battle for global tech regulation taking place in Brussels. It doesn't really feel like the Trump administration is like giving it their all and really doing as much as I think a lot of the tech companies thought they were going to do. And maybe some tech companies have said, well, this could generate blowback. So we'll see. I think this is, again, one to watch. We've done some interviews with Abe Newman and others where, this is a big area to sort of circle for potential explosion of transatlantic relations taking place. The US is showing that it cares about it, but it's not necessarily showing that it's willing to destroy transatlantic relations over it. I think that's perhaps a signal to Europeans that it doesn't really need to cave here. We'll see how this progresses.
I think that's right. And last two small thoughts for me is one, I think on your last point, just this administration, the US administration is just really focused on many, many things at once, which makes it hard to really put all the pressure on one thing. They've tried to put so many things on the table, other trade framework agreements, other peace efforts. So I think you could understand the laser focus is not there because they're divided among many, many things. And the second and last thought is just this is kind of what happens when you announce a framework agreement as this big deal that has incredibly vague language, which from the start, you could tell what one side and the other side were going to interpret it as. And that interpretation was not going to be the same. But I think that's probably a great way to transition to our conversation with Cecilia Malmström, because we'll talk a lot more about all these trade dynamics.
We are thrilled to welcome Cecilia Malmström to the Eurofile. Cecilia served as European Commissioner for Trade from 2014 to 2019, and as European Commissioner for Home Affairs from 2010 to 2014. As European Commissioner for Trade, which is what we're going to talk about today, Cecilia represented the European Union in the World Trade Organization and other international trade bodies. She was responsible for negotiating bilateral trade agreements with key countries, including agreements with Canada, Japan, Mexico, Singapore, Vietnam, and the 4 founding Mercosur countries. She is currently a senior advisor at Covington Burling's Brussels office and a non-resident senior fellow with our friends at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, just across the street on Mass Ave. Cecilia, welcome to the show. I can't think of any better guest to talk about what is happening right now on the EU trade agenda because it feels very action packed. And I think maybe the place to start is to go back in time to the dog days of summer and the Turnberry golf course where EU officials mostly grinned and took a picture with Donald Trump inking a trade agreement with the United States that was not reciprocal, that agreed to 15% tariffs that the US would put on, but the EU wouldn't retaliate. Maybe to start with, looking back on the US EU trade talks, what's your takeaway from what happened there?
Well, thank you, Max, for inviting me. It's great to be with you. Well, I think nobody could be proud of that agreement. In fact, I don't really know if it's an agreement in the proper sense of the word, where you negotiate, when you agree, where you have legally binding commitments, where it's fully transparent, and where you have a paragraph on how to solve conflicts and things like that. It's a deal. It's not a beautiful deal, but it's a deal. Was it the only possible one? Maybe, historians will say, but it's not a beautiful thing. As you said, the tariff for the European Union is 15%, which is lower than the 30% that we had a few weeks before, but it's still much higher than before Liberation Day. Actually, it's the highest tariff in transatlantic trade since before the Second World War, so it's bad. And we still have those 50% tariffs on steel, copper, and aluminium, and a few other things. So it's not a good deal. In addition to the tariff lines, there was also a decision that the European Union, meaning the companies in the European Union, would invest in the US for an amount approximately to $600 billion, and that the EU would buy weapons and energy for $700 or $750 million, I think, which is hard to follow up, which is hard to scrutinize, which is hard to evaluate, but it's a sum and it's a deal that could be presented as a result. So what the EU is doing right now is that it has passed proposals to the member states and the European Parliament to make this sort of legally binding, to get away with the tariffs for the US. And it has also produced a list of goods that they want accepted from the tariffs as well. I think there will be a meeting in Brussels next week between the EU Commissioner, Maros Sefcovic, and Jameson Greer to discuss how to move on. So it's still not fully settled, but this is what the rest of the world has done as well. The UK, Australia, Switzerland, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, etc. Everybody has made deals that are not beautiful, but they are deals.
I wonder if the deal that the EU struck, does that change how you think about the inherent power of the European Union? The EU is often described as a trading superpower. It's the EU market. The economy is the same size as the US and China. And so on trade, it should operate kind of at an equal level. But here, I think what clearly happened, at least in my reading, is that the US sort of tied the security issues, both Ukraine as well as NATO, got tied in with trade. And therefore, when you connect those two, well, the EU is not strong on the security side, strong on the trade side, and therefore had to make concessions. Does this change how the EU kind of sees itself in the global trading environment in the world? Are there sort of big picture takeaways that you think EU leaders should be taking from these talks? Or is it a case of Trump was wielding a stick, he was hitting everybody, you just had to get out of that violent situation, and then you sort of move on and you try not to think about it that much? Are there big lessons or takeaways that you had from the affair?
Well, it was humiliating, of course, and I would have wished the EU was a little bit tougher. You could have retaliated a little bit in the beginning, as they did. They actually announced a retaliation against the steel and aluminium tariffs in the beginning, but then withdrew them immediately after 24 hours. I think they could have remained just to make a point that we don't want to be treated like this. So that was unfortunate. But I think you're onto something really important. This was a thing that had to be done. It was a stick. There was not much there. And the security part and the support for Ukraine was very much into the picture. The EU leaders were afraid to irritate the US administration too much because of Ukraine. They still thought at that time they could get the US on Ukraine's side and continue the support. So that hung over the sort of agreement very much. And there will probably be lots of books and essays written about this, what happened and what lessons. But I think after this meeting this summer, the EU has moved on with a quite frenzy, I would say, to make other trade agreements to sort of compensate, to say that, okay, now we have this conflict with the US, we will still keep on trading with the US. We've been trading for centuries, and that trade is important. But maybe we should also focus a little bit on de-risking from the US, from diversifying and so on. And that's what the whole world is doing right now, trying to minimize the conflict with the US and diversifying. So the EU has entered into a phase of doing a lot of proper trade agreements with other partners.
Correct me if that's wrong. It feels to me like you were trade commissioner really in the heyday of big trade agreements or big efforts, both on the EU side, but on the US side as well, under President Obama's second term. And then we kind of saw a dip, kind of the mood turning against some of these big trade agreements. Even for the agreement with Canada, my home country and home region, Wallonia, made it very difficult to pass this for a while. And then COVID happened, and we thought, maybe are we in a new protectionist era? And we're talking about industrial policy. It felt at the time like maybe the tide was turning a little bit against this big era of free trade. But the agreements that you just described, it seems like maybe we might be turning back. Do you see this as being a temporary thing because it's a response to what the Trump administration is doing and the rest of the world is trying to find a way to cope? Or do you see this staying for the long term? We saw Mercosur, for example, we've been waiting for such a long time for this agreement to pass. Do you feel like there's still a lot of political will for things like this, or is just a temporary way to cope with this administration?
No, I think the world has changed quite a lot. You're absolutely right that during COVID and so on, there was much preoccupation on what's going to happen. But trade worked surprisingly well. There was a dip in the beginning, but trade is a bit like water. It finds its ways. And we didn't see these big collapse of trade as predicted in the beginning. And on the contrary, it showed that it was important to get the services and the goods despite the shutdown of basically the whole world. But what we are realizing now is that the world as we used to know it has gradually disappeared. I mean, we have a world where the US and the transatlantic relation is, if not dead, at least in a very deep sense of coma, where we have the US and China sort of trying to divide the world between them, where we have the weakening of international organizations. We have a very strong geopolitical dimension of the world today. So trade is becoming even more geopolitical than it was before. And that, I think, the EU has realized, as well as many others. This is not something that happened overnight. It's not something that came automatically after the election of the second administration of Trump. This has been gradually. And all the subsidies that you referred to, and also very much expressed in the IRA bill by President Biden, we saw an explosion of subsidies all over the world, not only in the US. The EU did it, China did it, Canada did it, India did it, Indonesia, and what have you. And there are lots of research being done. There was an increase of tens of thousands of subsidies in only a few years. And of course, that influenced trade. And the big climate issue that we have, that how can trade play a constructive role in the green transition? How can trade be more responsible? And so all this played in, of course, and has made that trade is not only about exchanging goods and services and facilitating market access. It is also a way to engage or not engage geopolitically and to try to solve a whole lot of other matters concerning subsidies, concerning green trade, and also concerning economic relations or economic diplomacy in a way that we didn't see before to the same extent.
I'd be curious for your view on this. I mean, at the beginning of President von der Leyen's second term, she really talked about a shift to that effect of a new economic foreign policy. And we're talking a lot, obviously, about economic security, countering economic coercion. What's the main difference that you see coming out of the commission, which obviously does a lot on trade, in this second term? And are we seeing trade considerations bleeding into other aspects of EU policymaking? For example, when we think about, you said, we made a deal to buy a lot of energy. Was that really part of the plan? And digital regulation, et cetera. What are the major shifts that you're seeing in the Commission's approach to this trade agenda?
Well, during the first von der Leyen Commission, there was nothing happening on trade, really. I mean, there were some minor things. I don't think it was really on her agenda. She had this grand plan on the Green Deal, which I think was admirable, but trade was not part of that. They did some minor things, you follow up, and the New Zealand agreement entered into force, but that was mainly, technical to get because it was done. But now, as I said, and as you said as well, it has become much more geopolitical. For instance, the whole Mercosur agreement, despite some skepticism still remaining in France and other countries, I think everybody has realized that this is not only about trade, this is about really forging closer relations with countries with whom we have historical ties in the Latin American continent, trying to diversify and consolidate our trade relations, not only vis-à-vis the US, but also vis-à-vis China. When I concluded Mercosur the first time in June 2019, when we thought it was done, the EU was the most important trading partners for all four Mercosur countries: Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Now it's China, because we didn't manage to finalize the agreement. We couldn't get it done. And there are a whole lot of reasons to this. But of course, China came in, as they very often do. They find a spot and they fill a hole and they take advantage of this very skillfully. So it has become geopolitical in a different way. And that plays in very much. I think that they have realized in the Commission and in the member states that we need to get as many of these closer ties and allies as possible right now, because you need all the friends you can get. And that plays also into the security area. We don't know if we can trust the American administration right now in NATO. They're still in, and the European and other members are scaling up their expenditure and their defense investments. But there's also a stronger European dimension of security, and there is this growth of the coalition of the willing, mainly in relation to Ukraine and possible future security guarantees, but also a new way to create alliances. And we see that in trade, we see that in climate, and I think we will see it in other areas as well. Sort of coalition of countries who think that, well, we want to cooperate according to some rules, to some framework. We don't accept the notion that this is the rule of the jungle and multilateralism is totally dead. So I think that is a little hopeful in a gloomy world. And we saw it yesterday. For the first time, the European Commissioner for Trade, Maroš Šefčovič, was at a ministerial meeting with ministers from all the CPTPP countries in Australia. And they signed a common statement, which is not super detailed yet, but it's a very important common step of working together to strengthen, modernize, and develop WTO together with other willing countries, and also to strengthen the trade and other cooperation between them. I think that is a milestone in many ways. I've been proponing this for many, many years, but now it's finally happening. And that shows that not only the EU is thinking that way, also other countries.
We should just say, when you say yesterday, we're recording this on November 21st.
I think we first met in Spain, actually at a conference during the Biden administration, where you gave a speech calling for the EU to join CPTPP or adhering to it or developing close ties. And it seemed like a pretty pie in the sky idea. And that was only, a few years ago. And now it's happening. And so maybe we could get into the flurry of engagement that the EU is doing with countries and with regions around the world. Senior EU trade official remarked to me this year, yeah, we had to sort of do damage limitation with the US. That represents 20% of our trade, but the rest of the world is 80%, and we're trying to expand that. So when you look at the world now, I mean, maybe we can start with CPTPP, but there's also India, Mercosur, there's hope to sort of finally absolutely get that ratified through the EU gauntlet this fall. India, UAE, all the CPTPP countries in both the Pacific and South America. But then also you have countries in ASEAN that are sort of stuck between China and the US, and so Indonesia. So maybe you could just talk about the landscape of how would you sort of rack and stack everything that the EU is doing. Is this sort of too much activity? Are people that you're talking to in the commission, are they being burned out? What are you sort of looking for here in the EU's engagement with the rest of the world?
Well, they are working really hard, I have to say, and they've been really active these last 6-7 months. You mentioned Indonesia. An agreement with Indonesia was concluded earlier this year. There was something that was launched when I was Trade Commissioner. It was difficult. Indonesia is a great country in many ways, but it's also one of the most protectionist countries in the world. So it was difficult to advance. But I think they were also, as you say, under pressure from other big powers to see how can we expand our network of friends and trading partners, but also speeding up the internal reforms that are really needed in Indonesia and have been difficult to pass through. So an agreement with Indonesia is done. It's now being legally scrubbed and it will be translated and so on. So it's not into force yet, but still is there. The Mercosur agreement, there has been an additional chapter on sustainability and forest management, mainly related to the Amazonas, to the original agreement. And the aim, if all goes well, is to have a signing ceremony just before Christmas in Brazil. India, another country with whom we've been negotiating for 20 or 23 years, they say that there will be an agreement around New Year. I'm not sure that is realistic because there's a lot of difficult issues in that as well. But at least they're talking and they have passed some sort of really difficult obstacles, which is great. The EU is engaging with CPTPP. It has bilateral agreements with most of the countries there. So we'll see what happens if they can agree on some sort of umbrella agreement and maybe talk about rules of origin and some standards and so on. Negotiations with Australia were interrupted a few years ago. That was part of also the visit in Australia with the CPTPP. There was bilateral meetings between
And
the EU Commission and
and and,
Australia.
and with CPTPP, it's just hard for the EU to just outright join the
Yes. Yeah.
CPT, because maybe you could just quickly say why. Why would it be so hard for the EU to just say, okay, we're going to adhere?
Well, the CPTPP is a very special animal as well. I mean, it's a coalition of 12 countries who have trade agreements between each other, but they have agreed to move forward. It's not very institutionalized. It doesn't have a headquarter. It doesn't have some sort of secretariat or anything like that. And the EU has individual agreements with them. So the question is, how do you actually join a network like that? I think it could be done, but it's quite technically complicated because you need to have the bilateral agreements still working and then build up on a sort of umbrella with some joint commitments. But it could be done. I know that both Australia, Japan, and Canada and others have been looking at this and they think it could be done. But for the time being, at least there's a rapprochement, which is good. And you could work on some standards in climate, for instance, green trade. You can work on digital trade. You can work on rules of origin to make them compatible and so on. So it will have to be a process. But also CPTPP has a long list of countries who want to join. So it's one of the most dynamic areas in the world right now, actually.
Yeah, I mean, geopolitically, CPTPP or TPP, when I was in the Obama administration, I was working on the security plank of the Indo-Pacific pivot, but there was this big economic plank that then died in 2016 during the election. But it seemed like CPTPP was missing an anchor market, and that's sort of what the EU is stepping in and providing. And when you talk about India and Indonesia, you're talking about the largest country in the world by population and the fourth largest country in the world. And with Mercosur, a very big region, Brazil, Argentina, a number of other countries. If the EU completes all these trade agreements, how will it reshape Europe's economy, the global economy? What impact do you see kind of longer term, 5, 10 years from now? Let's just assume the EU gets all these deals done. Does that kind of reorder the global economic space? What role do you see this playing in a kind of global context?
Well, it's not a quick fix to sort of set a new global order, but it certainly signalized that a vast majority of the world's countries, and there are other regional trade agreements going on as well, actually do want to trade under some sort of common rules framework, multilateral institutions and rules, predictability, where you know how to operate and so on. And yes, the US have melded itself out of this. China is also not following the WTO rules, and they are, of course, huge economic power. You cannot disregard them. But if there is a unification of the middle powers to show that, okay, but at least we will keep on trading like this. And eventually it will show that American business will lose out because they are not part of all these free trade agreements where you get preferential access and preferential treatment in very important and growing markets. So I think maybe one day they will realize that, maybe we should come back. Ideal, of course, we would do all this within the premises of the WTO, but we all know that's not possible right now. But at least if you have the WTO rules as a basis, and then you can build up and sort of develop them and be transparent about this, I think this could be actually a way to actually develop new global rules in the green trade area or in the digital arena, especially with a large group of countries who see the importance of this. How much will it affect the EU economy? Well, there are impact assessments being done for all these individual agreements. I don't have them here and now. Of course, it will be important. It will create new possibilities for new markets. But that is also very much dependent on how the EU does its own internal cuisine. We're right now in the process of talking all the time, the buzzwords about competitiveness and innovation and the Draghi report and so on. All this is being rolled out, not fast enough, according to Draghi himself, and with a lot of political challenges as well. But that has to go hand in hand with the external dimension, of course.
I definitely want to talk about China because we've
Hmm.
mentioned it in tangential ways a few times at this point. But first, you teed me up so nicely for another question I have that relates to standards compliance, but also the impact inside the EU. We just talked at the global level, which I think is something that citizens in the European Union sometimes struggle with, is this idea that trade is such a
Mm.
high level thing, but it has very real impacts day to day on citizens. I know there was some talk around the Indonesia agreement. Did we
Mm.
let go of some standards around deforestation, anything like that? And what is your view of how the EU is approaching some of these dynamics from WTO compliance, but also the fact that trade is not necessarily the most popular, or free trade is not necessarily the most popular policy at the very ground level for citizens? What kind of appetite is there for this, and what's the impact potentially on the ground?
Well, I haven't seen the latest opinion polls on this, but I'm not sure trade is so conflictual as it was the first year of me being trade commissioner. There were huge protests all over, and it was really a toxic area. And you mentioned Wallonia before, a region in Belgium who did everything they can to stop the EU-Canada agreement, which is one of the most successful trade agreements on earth, actually, also for Belgium. So it's in force now. But I think it is less toxic, and maybe the actions of the Trump administration has helped that a little bit, showing that there's good trade as well. And if you trade well, and if it's transparent, and if it's rule based, it has advantages when you go shopping, when you want to have access to certain products, when you look at the prices, when you see that there are new things coming from new countries with whom we didn't trade before, and so on. So it is, of course, important that politicians and negotiators and others sort of try to explain and to make it as accessible and concrete as possible for citizens what it means. And also to make sure that the values that we pride ourselves to defend are also enshrined in those agreements, that we do not lower standards on consumer protection or on environmental protections or fundamental rights as expressed in international conventions and so on. Then there will always raise questions, was this WTO compatible? Of course, the deal with Trump is not WTO compatible, but it is not for any country of the world. So we are all sinners. But I think the EU at least tries very much to do trade agreements that are compliable with WTO rules. There are discussions right now about something that is not a trade agreement but affects it, which is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, a price on carbon that is gradually rolled out in the EU, that when exporters to the EU will have to pay a fee based on the carbon emission of all the steps in the production. And both China and India has taken that to the WTO, claiming it is not WTO compliant. When you talk to the EU lawyers, they are all totally affirmative that this is WTO compliant. We'll see. It hasn't been tested in that regard yet, but it's also being reformed and phased in at a slower pace than was originally thought.
Well, now let's get back to China because we are
Yeah,
contractually obligated to talk about China on
of
every
course.
episode of this podcast. But we talked about CPTPP. We also talked about Washington so much as the impetus for a lot of these trade deals. But clearly, there's another actor here that is putting pressure on the EU and its trade agenda. I mean, we've seen Brussels take some steps, for example, on EV investigations. How do you view Brussels' positioning these days towards Beijing, but also in the middle of whatever is happening between Beijing and Washington, which seems to be different every month? What have you seen, and what does that signal for the next year, 2 years of this trade relationship with China?
China is, on the one hand, an important trading partner for the EU. And a lot of that trade is rather unproblematic. We trade, and that's important. However, we have shared many of the criticism coming from Washington for many years that we have concerns about China because they are not following the level playing field. They have too many subsidies. They have these state enterprises. They are dumping prices. They are not following normal rules. The lack of rule of law makes it difficult for companies to operate there. There is this forced technology transfer. I mean, the list is very long. And in addition, you can also add the violation of human rights, etc. So those concerns have been there for a very long time. But I think the EU has become tougher the latest years because, of course, the effects on the European economy of this dumping, of this state subsidies, and of this not following the rules have been much more obvious. And when they coincide with Europe not being as competitive as we should be, of course, this creates troubles. You have seen it you mentioned EVs. There is also in some of the solar panels, in some of cement. You see it in some medical devices. You see it even in sort of screws that they had some anti-dumping decision the other day. That is amounting. There's almost 20 or 25 ongoing anti-dumping investigations from the European Commission vis-à-vis different products from China. But of course, I mean, the EU does it the proper way. These investigations take a long time. They are 1,000 pages. They are public. You can read them online. And after that, there is a decision. So you don't impose tariffs overnight, as some other countries do. But however, that raises the question, especially in the green technology, because we also have to admit that the best green technology of the world is Chinese. And we need that in the green transition. And the Chinese EVs, yes, many of them are the result of state-owned companies and of subsidies and so on, but they're actually quite good quality, and they are more pricey than many of the Europeans who have not been able to be as competitive on this. So it's very, very complicated. And depending on which country you belong to, some are calling for tougher measures vis-à-vis China, others are calling for a little bit of relaxation of these measures as well, because we're 27 different countries. So it is complicated. But in addition, you have the big geopolitical problem with China is that China is enabling Russia's war in Ukraine. And that is the main obstacle to a rapprochement. There was a summit this July between the leaders of EU and China, and it didn't result in anything. There was some statement on cooperation on the green agenda. Nice words, but not very committal, because this also hangs over all of it to Ukraine.
Maybe one final question, and there'll be a lot packed in here, but there's a critique of the EU as it being too attached to the rules, that the EU is still sort of operating by the old order, very focused on WTO compliance. Meanwhile, the US and China are just sort of off doing whatever they want. And so the EU is doing sort of lengthy investigations into anti-dumping. Meanwhile, I think there's a lot of concern, particularly in Germany, of a second China shock, or this will really being this massive China shock that could destroy effectively German manufacturing. There's calls for just need to act faster. Let's drop WTO compliance. How do you see that? And to me, it's sort of, there's two things going on, both the EU trying to stick to WTO compliance, but also moving on CBAM. We've also seen, as mentioned with the deforestation initiative with Indonesia, my colleague, Greg Polling here at CSIS that works on Southeast Asia, we're sort of shocked about the Indonesia agreement because suddenly the EU dropped a lot of its environmental concerns that were standing in the way of really moving forward. So sort of maybe a more realist, hard-edged EU also emerging. So how do you see this going forward? Is the EU going to have to stay attached to the WTO when perhaps none of the big trading powers are? Is the EU also becoming a bit more hard-edged and dropping some of its other concerns that were getting in the way of deals and just trying to push deals forward because it recognizes that it needs to get them done? And so how do you see the EU's posture here? Is it still the rules-based operator, or is it going to shift to being a power that is using its power to move forward? And sometimes that's going to be WTO compliant. Sometimes it might not be. How do you see this going forward?
Well, it's an excellent question, Max, and very difficult to answer, because on the one hand, if the EU does not obey by the international rules, those rules and compliance with norms is what makes EU the EU. EU is a value-based corporation. It is enshrined in our treaties that we must follow these rules. We are a body of law. And in order for that quite complicated monster that the EU is, or animal rather, it's not a monster, it has to be bound by those laws, ensuring that all the countries can follow and that the outer world see what's going on. So if the EU just gave up that, it would sort of implode the whole European project in a way. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it is very committed to those rules. On the other hand, it is becoming, as you also point out, a little bit more pragmatic, saying that maybe, yes, we do, but maybe on some areas we can be a little bit more relaxed because we need to get a deal, and that is more worth than really complying to the norms as we used to do 10 years ago, for instance, on palm oil and on forest with Indonesia. And if we're ever going to get a deal with India, it will have to be a smaller deal, not in the sense of WTO compliant that it includes 80% or 85% of all the tariffs. It will have to be a bit smaller and maybe a bit more sectoral. So I think it's trying to navigate between sticking as much as it can by the rules, but also realizing that we have to be a little bit pragmatic as well. So it's also doing all these other deals, which are not trade deals, but are memorandums of understanding or cooperation specifically focused on rare earth and on minerals. Just concluded one big agreement with South Africa this week. It has done so with Uzbekistan, with Namibia, with Greenland, and a few others. So broadening a little bit the toolbox, trying to remain as strict as possible. And also the result that the EU, and especially the European Parliament, who has a say in all these agreements, is becoming more and more polarized as well, and are saying that too much regulation is also killing totally our competitiveness, and trying to unravel some of these rules that took years to agree upon.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Cecilia Malmström, thank you so much for being on the Eurofile. There's a lot more we could talk about. But thanks again for coming back, and we'll hope to have you back soon.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.